Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that overly kind introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with everybody today. I've met a couple of you kind of in one-on-one conversations. Looking forward to meet a couple of you kind of later. Everything's been great. So I'm really excited to be here to kind of share some recent work with my friend and frequent collaborator, Nick Gratz, who's currently a postdoc at Princeton and would love to come to Wisconsin for a job, whoever makes those decisions. But before getting too far into the kind of like nitty-gritty empirical weeds of this particular project, I did want to take just a brief moment to kind of introduce myself to the Wisconsin research community a little bit more broadly, right? COVID's been a, well, among other things, a really strange time to start off as an assistant professor. And that among other things, I really haven't had a chance to kind of like see a bunch of people around conferences, have the little shiny professor name badge on, and at PAA and kind of get a chance to kind of know people, right? So this piece today, I think, is a really useful tool for making that kind of introduction. And that probably summarizes me as a researcher better than any other single project could. It's a little funky with the statistics. It typifies a type of substantive question connecting broad systems of racism to individual well-being that I typically ponder over. And maybe most on brand, and don't come at me for saying on brand in a talk. It demonstrates important considerations for how we might want to go about using quantitative data to implicate structural racism and larger population inequities. So again, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today to share this work with y'all, to give you just a bit of a glimpse into the mind of Mike, the researcher. And ultimately, I hope that by the end of the talk, and even beyond that, how many people are going to PAA? Oh, great, amazing, great. So in contexts like that, we can chat about some of these larger ideas, particularly some of the tensions about using quantitative data to understand the production of population and social inequity that you've been grappling with in your own research. Is the thing right? Okay, great. Oh. But okay, enough about me. I hate talking about me. I know nobody made me do that, but I still did it. So let's go ahead and jump straight into business. So to give you a general sense of what we're going to be talking about over the next hour or so, today we're going to interrogate the so-called health legacy of redlining through an analysis of two interrelated questions. So first off, we're going to examine the mechanisms that explain how and why the state's decision to label neighborhoods as either desirable or hazardous way back in the 1930s ended up shaping mortality outcomes within those same places today. And then second, we're also going to kind of examine the extent to which this particular act of institutionalized racism can explain the massive disparities in life expectancy that we observe across racialized communities today. And so we have a ton of ground to cover before coming to hopefully reasonable answers to these two questions, including some reflections on historical context, on methodology, and much more. So let's go ahead and jump into things. So we have a prayer of getting through this on time. Spoiler alert, we will not get through this on time, but I'm already up here and you cannot dislodge me at this point. So, I'll also say, like, please, I know this is the norm here, but save kind of everything but clarifying questions for the end. So again, I can, have a prayer of kind of making through the content in a reasonable amount of time. But okay, so to kick things off, we need to first start with a little bit of a history lesson. And in particular, we need to start our conversation off by taking a look back at the state of the American housing market way back in the 1930s. Now, at this kind of particular point, the U.S. housing market was in a state of absolute disarray due to fallout from the Great Depression, where, among other things, individuals were struggling to meet housing payments to avoid foreclosure. And so, to help stabilize this really chaotic housing landscape, where the foreclosure rate was starting to exceed more than 1,000 lost properties each day, which is obviously quite considerable, the government decided to step in as part of this much larger New Deal era policy agenda and funnel considerable investments into kind of individual households, including maybe most importantly, extending federally backed mortgages and subsidies to private homeowners, which ultimately did kind of help to kind of calm this chaotic landscape to a degree. Now, while such kind of aggressive state policy seems to be incredibly, especially by today's lofty standards, progressive, this New Deal era intervention into housing ultimately ended up latching onto and exasperating pre-existing inequities between communities. So indeed, in deciding how exactly to dole out these kind of life-saving capital investments to American households, local governments across the country partnered up with the federally sponsored Homeowners Loan Corporation. Is there a laser pointer in here, by the way? Okay, yes. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, or HOLC for short, to develop these so-called residential security maps, which are now more commonly known as HOLC maps. Here's an example of one of these maps that was drawn for kind of the St. Louis metropolitan area. Now, the purpose of these maps was to provide a general sense, a rough guide on how suitable an area's residents were for receiving some of the support in this New Deal era program. And HOLC ultimately chose to communicate their final assessments of this so-called risk of investing in particular places through a simple, straightforward 4-category classification scheme. Now, scores in this neighborhood grading system ranged all the way from grade A, these green areas, which encoded that an area is best or safest for financial investment, all the way down to grade D, which are these areas marked in red, which was a label that was reserved for communities that HOLC deemed way too hazardous or way too risky to extend meaningful financial support to. If you invest money into or provide loans to this area, their logic was you probably will not get that investment back. Now, although HOLC claimed that the criteria that they used to determine these maps, this so-called risk of investing in particular places, was this really kind of scientific, nuanced, and objective thing, it was, unfortunately, like many other things in the world, actually really, really blunt and incredibly, incredibly racist, such that neighborhoods that were inhabited by people who were deemed non-white at the time, and we can come back to talk a little bit more about what that means and the implications of it, were deemed kind of like, or were systematically coded as hazards for investment or given this grade D or red label by HOLC. And here, it's really kind of hard to understate just how anti-Black the logic that was baked into HOLC mapping really was, right? As above, this quote makes crystal clear, and it's from NPR. I probably should have got the author, but as the quote makes kind of crystal clear, right? Even having one single Black household in a neighborhood, no matter what that neighborhood's other attributes were, was typically enough for the whole area to be marked off as way too risky to provide capital investment to. So overall, right, this is a specific historical process or project of the state explicitly segmenting neighborhoods according to some racialized notion of risk or worthiness is now what's often referred to as redlining. And this particular institutional project is considered so historically important because of just how impactful it was for consolidating the racialized geography of the United States at the time. Yeah. I actually don't know. I'm sure that it was like informed by that logic, whether kind of explicitly or unconsciously, but I think it's the same kind of logic of just kind of like, you know, how dangerous any proximity to kind of Blackness is in the mind of like kind of state actors. Yeah. The way that HOLC defines it, it's based on kind of like cultural kind of definitions, I believe. Like they weren't using it because they didn't use census tracts because most of the country wasn't tracked out at that point. I think it was just like kind of like cultural understandings of neighborhoods, which varied in size from city to city. And, you know, even within the same city, there was very different sizes. Yeah. Any other questions before going? Okay, great. So, like I said, this project is considered so absolutely historically important because it consolidated the racialized geography of the United States at the time. And indeed, although the racialization of places far predated Hulk mapping, right? Hulk did not kind of like invent kind of this idea that kind of proximity to Blackness was this harmful and risky thing that existed far beyond this point. What this particular institutional intervention did was kind of help to really codify the notion that an area's value was directly proportional to its racial composition. So putting that just a little bit differently, what redlining functionally did was marshal together a bunch of racist logics already existing across several public and private actors into an official and state-sanctioned racist theory on the value of places that almost overnight served to entrench racial segregation, facilitate this massive infusion of wealth into white communities, and further legitimize the practice of disinvesting in communities of color, kind of especially kind of like predominantly Black neighborhoods. Now, although kind of this kind of process where Hulk mapped its redlining grades onto neighborhoods occurred nearly a century ago at this point, with some immediate and disastrous consequences for social equity, recent research suggests that the consequences of this institutional exposure are still playing out today. So indeed, in this really kind of innovative data curation project that I get jealous of that I didn't do, scholars from the University of Richmond have recovered and digitized these Hulk maps, and these data becoming widely available have allowed researchers to begin to investigate if and how redlining is predictive of contemporary social outcomes. Now, the way that quantitative researchers have typically kind of moved through these investigations involves them first taking these digitized Hulk maps and laying them over top contemporary census tract boundaries in order to kind of classify neighborhoods in such ways as formerly A-graded or formerly D-graded. And then second, they use these derived categories to examine whether the experience of being marked as desirable or hazardous by the state during a particularly crucial moment in US history is predictive of social conditions within those same formerly marked spaces nearly a century later. And while scientists from across kind of the board have really taken up this task of matching up past and contemporary neighborhood boundaries to clarify the so-called legacy of redlining grades, population health researchers have been especially maybe the most busy here. And I think at least there are a couple of explanations for why health researchers have been so drawn to this type of scholarship recently, some of them more cynical, some of them actually kind of quite substantive. But a major factor compelling this sort of work forward, I think, centers around the fact that redlining represents a direct and, very importantly, well-recorded instance of the type of structurally racist exposure that critical health scholars have long centered as a root cause of health inequity. So indeed, as the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore states, structural racism is, at its very core, the state-sanctioned production of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And Hulk mapping represents one very clear manifestation of this type of structural violence in that it directly wrote racial discrimination into official state-sponsored policy. So on the whole, it's rare that we ever have such good and comprehensive quantitative data measuring these types of structural exposures that are theorized to be so absolutely essential to population health, making the release of these maps a unique opportunity to really move the field forward, a chance to really clarify and test some long-standing ideas about how acts of structural and institutionalized racism can have dramatic and durable impacts on health equity. Now, with all that said, to date, health researchers operating from this perspective of interrogating Hulk mapping as a possible generator of kind of long-lasting health inequity have overwhelmingly been focused on establishing that such a relationship does exist. And thus far, a wealth of empirical evidence does seem to kind of like bear this out. So indeed, the bulk of findings in this emergent kind of area of study suggests that contemporary health outcomes are tightly coupled with historical redlining grades, such that current residents of former A-graded neighborhoods tend to experience significantly better health outcomes than their peers living in grade D neighborhoods across a wide range of indicators, including cancer risk, preterm birth, self-rated health, depression, life expectancy, and much, much, much more. This plot from Nardone and colleagues kind of gives us the general sense of what the general thrust of the findings in this area are, demonstrating that kind of like contemporary residents of these kind of former A-graded tracts have significantly lower risk of adverse asthma-related outcomes. This is emergency asthma instances than their counterparts that are currently living in grade D kind of like areas. So overall, right, the big point of this is that if you can think of a health outcome, right, it's more than likely by this point to have been linked back to historical redlining grades, demonstrating this general kind of gradient pattern. So when we take this all together, the current literature does seem to indicate that Hulk mapping was this violent institutional intervention that is still nearly a century later somehow implicated in the production of health inequality. And yet, as valuable as these studies have been for confirming some important ideas about the connection between structural racism and population welfare, there is still considerable room to expand things here. And in particular, one outstanding kind of question concerns the underlying social process that is responsible for linking past to present. So in other words, the concrete historical mechanisms that explain why a neighborhood's redlining grade, assigned literally 100 years ago at this point, has any bearing whatsoever on health outcomes within that same place today is still a bit of an empirical black box. And putting that just a little bit differently, right? We currently have really strong evidence, depending on your take on it, that this long defunct policy intervention still wields considerable influence on community outcomes today, but also only a very flat and limited understanding of how this is at all possible, especially in face of the considerable social and technological changes to US society that occurred in the intervening decades. Now, of course, this isn't to imply at all that we lack any compelling theoretical explanations for this durable relationship of redlining grades and health. And in fact, a causal account that's at least implicitly invoked in the majority of quantitative studies on this topic revolves around a concept called spatial marking. Now, the Cliff Notes version of this argument is that the social meaning that was ascribed to neighborhoods via Hulk grades persisted well beyond the initial institutional intervention to stratify and segment the treatment of neighborhoods into perpetuity. So putting that differently, and you can see kind of an example of this from a paper from Nancy Krieger and colleagues, but generally this perspective kind of argues that the interpretation of grade A neighborhoods as these places that are kind of valuable, desirable, and worth investment, and of grade D neighborhoods as places that are generally lesser and hazardous, escape the bounds of the program that they were originally designed to guide, and instead became deeply fixed into the underlying logic of many subsequent systems organizing privileges and harms across communities. So indeed, it's generally thought that these state-sanctioned labels work their way into the mental models of public and private actors across the ensuing century, compelling them to perpetually extend positive, health-relevant investments onto grade A areas, while also consistently layering health hazards and harms onto grade D areas, which ultimately culminated in significant health disparities between these classes of neighborhoods over time. Now, although this spatial kind of marking framework is, at least to me, conceptually appealing for explaining this durable relationship of redlining grades and contemporary health outcomes, we do currently lack an empirical account of this idea, one that explicitly traces out the development of grade A and D neighborhoods across a century of considerable urban change, and identifies how these divergent trajectories led to the health disparities that we observe between these groups of spaces today. So given all of that, we formulate the following hypothesis, which we very, very creatively call the spatial marking hypothesis, as a first target of evaluation for our project. And here we hypothesize that census tracts graded as D by Hulk in the 1930s followed substantially different historical trajectories, particularly along the axes of these place-based mediators that I list out here and will motivate in a bit more detail shortly. Then did those census tracts that were once labeled as grade A, which resulted in differential life expectancy between these places nowadays. Now, as a very quick aside, we argue that it's particularly important to document specific mediating pathways in this case and in others, as doing so crystallizes what I think is an essential kind of like theoretical point that institutional exposures like redlining are so absolutely transformative, not because they exert some kind of some sort of single shot, static, once in time effect on population outcomes, but instead by spreading out and seeping into the underlying logic of various systems that follow. Now, making this point crystal clear has some very important implications for how we may want to situate redlining and similar acts of racialized violence within an agenda of restorative justice, i.e., not in only focusing on the so-called direct effects of these exposures, but also in attending to the specific mediating factors and, even more difficult, the logics that have been distributed by these types of events. But that's a much larger, kind of gooier point that I'm going to yell about a lot at the end in the conclusion. And instead of getting too far of ahead of ourselves with all of that for now, let's instead consider another way that folks have begun to really conceptualize the durable health legacy of redlining grades. And in particular, note that we might also want to interrogate the health legacy of of Hulk mapping by considering how much of a disparity in outcomes across the contemporary geography of race and class can be explained by this neighborhood marking intervention. And so to expand on that just a bit more, consider that redlining grades have in both scientific and popular discourse become positioned as some sort of crucible for contemporary racial inequities and a variety of social outcomes, including, of course, population health. And the broad strokes behind this argument are pretty straightforward, right? Indeed, if kind of specified in that logic of the spatial marking framework, redlining grades were these place-defining exposures that transformed the treatment of neighborhoods for decades and decades after their application. And Black and brown neighborhoods were overwhelmingly labeled with grades that triggered these long histories of disinvestment and harm, while white communities were almost exclusively marked with grades that triggered long chains of positive investment. Then it follows that this discriminatory application of redlining grades way back in the past was a major accelerant towards the racial disparities in health that we observe today. Putting it just a little bit more directly, right? The implicit logic to this sort of increasingly common argument is that if not for Hulk mapping, this huge state-sponsored intervention that targeted durable harms at Black and brown neighborhoods, but long-lasting privileges at white communities, contemporary racial disparities wouldn't be quite as massive as they are now. Now, as appealing as that claim is at first blush, right, there is some uncertainty around it that does need to be resolved empirically. And to motivate this uncertainty just a bit, consider that roughly 70% of the most hyper-segregated Black working class communities today are not located in census tracts or areas that were ever marked as grade D. And yet, these areas that were never formally marked as hazardous for investment by the state still have come to experience systematic disinvestment, marginalization, and overexposure to the place-based risk factors that drive poor health today. Putting that a little bit more technically for some particular folks in the room, right? Many Black communities today seem to have arrived at similar marginalized conditions to one another, regardless of their Hulk treatment status in the past. And on the flip side, many white communities today seem to enjoy excess access to essential health privileges, regardless of how they were spatially marked by the state way back in the 1930s. So when you take in this all together, this pattern where units seem to have arrived at similar outcomes, despite their considerably different kind of differential treatment status, casts some doubt on this kind of like emergent popular claim that the spatial marking of neighborhoods via Hulk was this sort of game-changing catastrophic event for racial equity. So given this kind of uncertainty, we pose a second, also very creatively named hypothesis for evaluation on a project, which we call the structural hypothesis. And here we predict that there's an immense gap in life expectancy between Black working class and white professional class communities today, but also that only a very small portion of this total disparity can actually be explained by Hulk grades that were assigned to neighborhoods way back in the 1930s. And importantly, and I'm going to talk more about this or yell more about this at the end, support for this hypothesis would not at all suggest that redlining was wholly unimportant for shaping the racialized distribution of premature mortality in the contemporary United States. On the contrary, as noted by kind of others theorizing structural racism, racial capitalism, and historical legacies of racial violence, including folks here at Wisconsin, right? This outcome would instead suggest that the ramifications of this mid-century redlining project likely extend far beyond the original bounds of Hulk maps into the system shaping outcomes of all neighborhoods today, whether they were marked or not, effects which are generally hard to identify when relying on quantitative models alone. But again, we'll loop back to that and I'll expand on that broader point in the conclusion in the discussion. All right. So that was an absolute marathon of information. So just to quickly recap our goals for this project before moving forward, we aim to interrogate the health legacies of redlining by identifying first, the concrete historical mechanisms linking Hulk grades to neighborhood health across a century of considerable neighborhood change. But also second, the extent to which these neighborhood level grades can be used to explain a total racial disparity in life expectancy that we observe across the contemporary US. All right, so there's way more to talk about here to really do these ideas justice. And if you want to read all about that, I'll direct you to the paper that just came out in Social Forces a few weeks ago for some more of that more background and conceptual meat. But I just realized I don't know how to read a clock. But to make sure that we have enough time to get through everything, let's go ahead and shift gears just a bit and talk about the analytical approach that we'll use to address these two research questions. And so to trace connections between past historical or past redlining grades and contemporary population health outcomes, we're going to approach everything from kind of a counterfactual mediation framework, which involves a number of moving parts. And so the first step in our analysis from this mediation perspective requires us to build out, oh, that looks terrible, requires us to build out a conceptual representation of how historical redlining grades might have arrived on contemporary health over nearly 100 years of change. And so to build this historical process out, we select 4 ordered mediators spanning 1930 to 2018 that proxy some of the core kind of theoretical dynamics through which redlining grades may have contributed to, or may have continued to shape neighborhood conditions well after their initial assignment. Now, a full treatment on why we chose the mediators that we did, it could probably fill a whole hour on its own. So you can come back to kind of some of the logic behind these choices in the Q&A. But just to give you a really rough sense of the logic behind our choices here, we select as potential mediators, first, so-called urban renewal projects from the 1950s and 1960s to proxy how redlining grades set the stage for subsequent forms of state-sponsored structuralized violence against vulnerable communities. Second, we select school segregation from the 1990s to proxy how redlining grades helped to consolidate various forms of racialized isolation that then became embedded in later systems distributing very important health-relevant resources like education. Third, we select housing values from the mid-2000s to proxy how the racist theory of value that was codified by Hulk mapping became baked into the housing appraisal process even decades later as home ownership became increasingly tied to wealth and thus to people's well-being. And then finally, as our last mediator, we chose contemporary neighborhood, racial, and economic isolation to proxy how redlining grades may still contribute to steering Black and working class households to all but a very, very, very narrow range of underinvested areas. Now, the big upshot of all this is that when we tie all these factors together, what we end up with is a broad representation and a very kind of insufficiently deep one. We can talk about what that means and the challenges that come with it and why we have to go with kind of just like a very broad representation instead of something a little bit deeper. But a broad representation of how the unequal distribution of life expectancy that we observe across neighborhoods today might plausibly be traced back to redlining grades. In other words, right, this diagram provides us with a working model of how more proximal predictors of health, like segmented housing markets or extreme segregation, are not just randomly kind of strewn about, distributed across neighborhoods, but instead may have been deeply informed by the distribution of past redline grades. Okay, so with that broad historical process set into stone, the next thing that we need to do is operationalize it with some data. And we do so by drawing on a number of kind of historical and contemporary sources kind of laid out right here. Now, in my view, the least interesting part of any talk is when somebody starts like reading it, kind of like their data list and all that other kind of stuff. We won't spend too much time kind of like just reading things to you right here. Instead, we can come back to kind of like the sources, some of the difficulties with all this in the Q&A. Instead, what I think is much more important for us to consider at the moment are the statistical tools that we're going to use to translate our conceptual model into answers to our research questions. And so in our first analysis of our so-called spatial marking hypothesis, what we're going to do is perform a mediation analysis that takes the life expectancy advantage that contemporary residents of grade A tracts currently experience over contemporary residents of grade D tracts and decompose or unfurl this total effect along the lines of the historical pathways that we've articulated in this conceptual model. Now, overall, this effect decomposition is going to allow us to answer things like, well, how much of this durable relationship between historical Holt grades and contemporary life expectancy can we attribute to housing value inequities that develop between these groups of neighborhoods down the line? And ultimately, to shed some light on the concrete mechanisms that have allowed grade A residents to live longer lives than their grade D counterparts, even to this day. And while that sounds neat, we actually have to do it. And to do so, like the tool that we're going to use to kind of do this effect decomposition, we're going to use something called the parametric G formula. And the broad motivation for this approach is that it allows us to kind of like net out these kind of like distinct pathways from our kind of like bigger conceptual model, while also kind of minimizing some impossible assumptions about the world that are baked into more traditional kind of regression or decomposition approaches, particularly some kind of messy assumptions about post-treatment variables, right? We don't solve all of them, not in the least, but it helps us kind of minimize some kind of assumptions that are a little bit untenable. Now, excuse the horribly shameless plug, but Nick, the brilliant Courtney Bone, and I have a paper that came out a couple of months ago in Journal of Health and Social Behavior that goes into the detail of the methodological issues in the method and much more details for those who just love looking at equations. But for the rest of us, what's much more important to consider now are the estimates that we identify via this approach, and what each tells us about how our mediators connect past redlining grades to present-day outcomes. So in short, we start by estimating kind of a quantity called the average treatment effect of redlining grades on life expectancy, which is simply defined here as the average difference in life expectancy between grade A and grade D tracts in the year 2018, conditional on a few pretreatment confounders that occurred before Holt mapping was applied. We then decompose this total effect into several decomposition quantities, including one controlled direct effect, the CDE, which tells us how much of the relationship between redlining grades and contemporary life expectancy is due to some pathway that we haven't captured in this conceptual model. We also break this total effect apart into several pure indirect effects pies, one for each mediator. And these clue us into how redlining grades shape the distribution of our chosen mediators across these differently marked neighborhoods. And then finally, we kind of break this apart into kind of several proportions attributable to interactions, PAIs, which kind of very, very broadly speaking, tells us how redlining grades transform the relationships between our measured mediating factors and later life expectancy. Now, at this point, these definitions may be a little bit squishy and abstract, maybe not for this audience because y'all are very sophisticated, but they are for me when I always just look at a big mess of symbols. But I swear all this is going to solidify when we take a look at them in context of our results, which we're going to get to very shortly. But before getting to kind of the results of that first analysis, let's very quickly run through the tools that we're going to use to answer our second research question, the one from that structural perspective. And remember that here we're asking how much of the life expectancy disparity that we currently observe between white professional class communities and Black working class communities can be explained by redlining grades that were mapped onto neighborhoods way back in the 1930s. And so to come up with an answer to this research question, what we're effectively going to do is simulate how this contemporary racial disparity might have otherwise manifested had Black working class tracts been marked as A rather than as D by the state 100 years ago. Putting that a little bit differently, kind of using these decomposition quantities that we estimate kind of are unfurled in this prior analysis, we're going to go back, at least conceptually, to the 1930s when redlining grades were originally doled out to neighborhoods, reshuffle the deck a bit, and mark all Black working class neighborhoods that had been assigned a D grade as if they had instead been assigned an A grade, and then simulate things forward from that point in time. So we then take the racial disparity in life expectancy that emerges within this counterfactual world and contrast it to the life expectancy disparity that we actually see emerge in reality. So in other words, a little bit more straightforwardly, what we're basically saying here is, okay, let's imagine for a second that the state did not engage in discriminatory Hulk mapping, that part's important, and that Black working class neighborhoods today that had been marked as hazardous way in the past had instead been able to enjoy that history of being marked as worth investment by the state so long ago. How much less would racial disparities be in this very, very optimistic scenario compared to what actually played out in the real world? And as I have noted down here, do note that we do take a couple of different bites at the apple here. This is a bit of a strange analysis. So you want to check and see that it's robust in a lot of ways, including some designs that kind of like manipulate the full range of kind of Hulk grades rather than just A versus D. But whatever way kind of we slice things up, we come to just about the same conclusions, which we will get to now. Okay, so to kick things off with the findings, the figure kind of above displays disparities in life expectancy that we observe across our samples of interest and those that we want to interrogate further. And so what we see here lines right up with our priors, or at least my priors, of what I might expect to see. So indeed, contemporary residents of grade A tracts tend to live about 6 years longer than contemporary residents of grade D tracts, while contemporary residents of predominantly white professional class communities tend to live about 9 years longer than contemporary residents of predominantly Black working class communities. And so this is a horrible, like not a great comparison, but just to contextualize these numbers just a little bit, seeing the difference in period life expectancy between the longest and 30th longest living country in the world right now, I think it's about 5 years. So seeing kind of inequities of like 6 and 9 years between kind of neighborhoods in the same country is quite considerable and important to kind of interrogate. But still, leaving that context aside, the big point of showing off these observed disparities is that they set the stage for our research questions. So indeed, to refresh your memory, what we effectively want to know is first, how exactly did residents of grade A neighborhoods come to experience this 6-year longevity advantage over their grade D counterparts? And also kind of like how much did this of this 9-year disparity between white professional class and black working class kind of life expectancies can we trace back to redlining grades that were applied to neighborhoods nearly a century ago? So this figure here shows off the results for our first inquiry, tracing that 6-year life expectancy gap between A and D neighborhoods along the historical mediating factors that we laid out in our conceptual model. And there's a whole lot going on here, all of it interesting, I promise. But for now, kind of we'll focus our attention in on this last panel, which shows up our key decomposition of life expectancy. And just to kind of summarize the key points for us, first off, these pure indirect effects marked in green suggest that the life expectancy disparity that we observe between grade A and D tracts today can largely be attributed to the unequal distribution of housing values and racial and economic segregation that emerged within these places or across these places in subsequent decades. To drill in on that just a little bit more, this PIE, the pure indirect effect for housing values, is estimated to be about 1.30 years, which suggests that nearly 20% of the life expectancy advantage that residents of grade A communities experience today is accounted for by inflated housing kind of prices within these neighborhoods. In other words, this estimate suggests that kind of redlining played a significant role in creating unequal property valuation across grade A and grade D tracts way down the line, and that this differential distribution of a key economic resource then generated life expectancy disparities between these communities. Now, additionally, kind of the PIE for race and class isolation kind of reveals a similar story, i.e. that a considerable portion of the contemporary disparity in life expectancy that we see between grade A and grade D tracts can be explained by extreme residential segregation that emerged across these places down the line. This estimate comes up to be about 2.5 years, meaning that about 2.5 years of that total 6-year disparity can be attributed to this mediator. So overall then, these decompositions, these PIEs, suggest that concentrated residential segregation and significant housing value inequities that developed within formerly graded neighborhoods well after Hulk mapping occurred are the primary culprits behind this contemporary place-based disparity, accounting for about 65% of the life expectancy inequality that we observe between A and D neighborhood, or formerly marked A and D neighborhoods today. But still, moving forward, right, the controlled direct effect here, marked in purple, tells us that a measurable portion of the grade A health advantage that we're interrogating still persists after accounting for all of these historical mediators. So indeed, about 1.8, just about 2 years of this kind of overall kind of like life expectancy disparity between neighborhoods appears to be due to some pathway or some factor that we haven't included in our conceptual model. Now, what these unobserved mechanisms may be, we can discuss later, but the upshot of this quantity is that there is still some intermediate forces linking past redlining grades to contemporary health that we haven't captured here. Now, finally, we do note that the proportions attributable to interaction, marked off here in yellow, for housing values and neighborhood isolation are significant as well, suggesting that redlining grades not only shape the distribution of these kind of health relevant kind of systems, but also the relationships between these systems and life expectancy, such that, for instance, housing values appear to be significantly more protective of health and well-being among grade A relative to grade D neighborhoods today. Now, why it is that redlining transformed the relationship of factors like these to health is certainly an open-ended question, and one that I'd love to get your kind of takes on in the Q&A. I think there's a ton of kind of like rich kind of like theorizing to do on explaining this kind of finding, and I'd love to hear thoughts. But leaving aside some of the fine-grained details of that for the moment, what we get from this first analysis is an emergent story for how Hulk mapping led to kind of a longevity gap between residents of grade A and grade D tracts over 100 years of neighborhood change. And we'll talk more about kind of the bigger implications of this story in the conclusion. But for now, let's turn our attention to that second research question, that one focused in on the even larger 9-year difference in life expectancy between contemporary Black and white neighborhoods. And again, what we want to know is how exactly did redlining grades participate in the production of this disparity? Well, obviously, this figure gives us an answer to that, showing off the results of our experiment, where we went back in time and simulated new historical trajectories for formerly redlined Black working class neighborhoods, had they only enjoyed being marked as desirable for investment by the state in the past. And once again, there's a lot kind of going on here in the other kind of facets of this plot. And again, it's all super interesting. I swear we can come back to it later. But for now, let's just focus in kind of on this last panel right here. Now, this is our key result for our second question, comparing the life expectancy disparity between Black and white neighborhoods as it's observed in the real world, which is what's marked in yellow, to what emerges in kind of our counterfactual simulated world, which is what's marked off here in purple. Now, we probably don't need too much help interpreting this graph, but just to do so, we can see very clearly that life expectancy disparities between these racialized communities change very little, almost not at all, kind of across these very distinct scenarios. So indeed, in the real world, residents of white professional class communities experience life expectancies that are about 9 years longer on average than residents of Black working class communities. And yet in our very, very optimistic, history manipulating, simulated world, this disparity comes up to be about the same, like a little bit over kind of 8 years of a life expectancy gap. So put differently, this suggests that some hypothetical intervention that would have democratized Holt's positive spatial marking grades way back in the day still would have resulted in nearly the same exact health gap between these racialized communities that to what actually emerged in reality. Now, again, there's a ton more to talk about here that we can get into later, but for now, the big take-home point is that it looks like redlining grades, conceptualized as a neighborhood marking exposure at least, appear to only account for a marginal portion of the massive inequality and premature death that we observe across these racialized communities today. So indeed, contrary to some emergent narratives, it appears as if this discrete institutional intervention, again, conceptualized as a neighborhood level kind of like exposure, was only a marginal participant in the production of contemporary health inequality across racialized populations. Okay, so with all that, we have some answers to our questions that hopefully people find kind of compelling. And I'm dying to have a discussion with you about the results, the broader implications, and what's next. But to help set the stage for that just a bit, I do want to very briefly recap and situate these findings. So first off, in examining Hulk maps from the spatial marking perspective, our results clarify the health legacy of redlining grades by tracing out the fallout of this structural exposure along several concrete historical pathways. And indeed, our results suggest that redlining grades largely, though not entirely, arrived on contemporary place-based vulnerabilities to premature death by producing more proximal and significant inequalities in neighborhood segregation and property valuation. And we also find some evidence to suggest that redlining grades became embedded not only in the distribution of these subsequent mediating systems, but also in the relationships of these systems to mortality. Now, as a larger takeaway here, do note that these results illustrate, again, what I think is an important concept for understanding the long-run production of stratification, which is that large-scale structural interventions like Hulk mapping are so catastrophic for population health equity, not because they exert some sort of immediate and static effect on outcomes, but rather by functioning as a dynamic exposure that continuously informs the logic of almost all systems from that point onward, even those decades and decades down the line, even potentially those removed, far removed from the initial intent of the intervention. Put a little bit more directly, these results suggest that when attempting to correct the fallout of these sorts of structural, often racialized acts of violence, we need not focus only on their so-called direct effects, but much more critically, we must attend to how these exposures and their associated logics became abstracted and deeply embedded into the very political economies of those places that directly experienced them, again, potentially informing even those systems therein that at face value seem unrelated to the original intervention. But still, kind of when viewing from a kind of a structural perspective, things from a structural perspective, our results also highlight that Hulk grades were only a small part of a much larger project of reproducing racialized geographies of premature death in the United States. Indeed, we find that massive life expectancy disparities exist among Black and white neighborhoods at the extremes of racialized and class isolation, but also that Hulk's spatial marking of neighborhoods offers only kind of marginal explanatory power for kind of like accounting for how these disparities arose. Now, again, as an absolutely key takeaway here, note that this finding does not necessarily suggest that redlining didn't matter for contemporary racial disparities, but rather that the dominant conceptualization of this exposure as a tract or neighborhood level event that only affected those neighborhoods that were, in a very clinical trial sense, treated by Hulk is likely missing the structurally racist force for the trees. So indeed, beyond being a discrete historical event that shaped outcomes only among a particular subset of areas, as is implied by that kind of one-to-one matching of past and contemporary land area that dominates kind of current quantitative investigations of this relationship, redlining's legacy for racial equity may be better conceptualized through how it enshrined a racist theory of value that spilled across all geographies in the United States. That is, rather than transforming outcomes among only areas that were explicitly evaluated or marked by Hulk, and implicitly assuming that unmarked neighborhoods were unaffected by this kind of act of state violence, the true harm of redlining, of crystallizing connection between racial composition and social worth, likely bounded across the entire nation, affecting the development of housing, labor, and other health-relevant systems across all neighborhoods in the United States, regardless of whether they were directly evaluated by Hulk or not. Now, overall, right, while this is probably a much more accurate conceptualization of the legacy of redlining, it is also one that's incredibly hard to kind of isolate in quantitative models alone, in that it requires the evaluation of really tricky and maybe someone has a way to do this, but I would say impossible counterfactuals like, what if the United States had not invested in the underlying logic of redlining whatsoever? And these quickly run up against the bounds of kind of traditional quantitative frameworks that have typically been developed in drug trials and other non-kind of social population inequity kind of like frameworks. And so ultimately, this highlights the broadest, gooeyest take-home point of all, which is the absolute importance of kind of social theory and triangulation across multiple methods when attempting to identify the full impact of this and other kind of large-scale structural exposures that we theorize to be so transformative for segmenting outcomes among the population. Indeed, only by bringing our full suite of kind of like analytical and theoretical perspectives to bear when interrogating kind of the results of these expansive acts of structural violence, can we fully hope to grasp the range of the durable consequences. Okay. Again, I have no idea what time it is right now, but I'm done. I've ranted at you long enough. Thanks for your attention, and thanks for looking forward to the discussion.
Wow, amazing. I'm so impressed. This is like a topic that's interesting to me. But I wanted to ask you, keep emphasizing it's not really so that it's not the full of structural forces at play. The fact that you like emphasize that one time implies that you have a different idea of the qualitative concept.
Oh, I have no idea, right? Yeah, no, but it's important. I mean, it's like we run into it. It's something that we need to keep in mind because I feel like, you know, these designs, okay, soapbox time, right? So I feel like a lot of these designs that we typically see to kind of like trace out these legacies of things like redlining, enslavement, other kind of like structural exposures, we kind of like fit them too closely to the data that we do have, right? And it's like, oh, okay, we can see that this is kind of like neighborhoods are marked. We can kind of like conceptualize this as a clinical trial intervention. I know that framework, that's how the data is set up. Let me go ahead and estimate things, even if kind of like our underlying theories don't match that framework at all. Now, what takes its place and how we kind of like the alternative designs that we need to use, I don't know, right? Like the thing about to get at some of this, I think we would have to kind of like have a data set that like showed us a version of the United States, a comparison case or a similar country that didn't engage in redlining. It's just like that surface just doesn't exist, right? And so it's like we need to kind of like not follow the data too carefully. But then when we start thinking about the alternatives, it's like, well, I don't know if we can say anything, right? So I don't know where we go with that. I think some promising stuff that we see is like, I don't know, if anyone's read that Jacob Faber paper from a couple of years ago, where he compared cities that redlined versus cities that didn't redline as kind of like a proxy of like, okay, this was a city that invested in the logic of like of segregationist logic versus ones that didn't. And he looked at, I think like contemporary financial or segregation outcomes or whatever, and showed that there was like that effect there. This like investment in kind of like the logic was kind of a key kind of driving force. I'm doing some work with Teresa Osipok at Minnesota, looking at that, like the health consequences of that. And we're seeing like, yeah, like kind of places, cities that are very similar up until the point of like investing in redlining, follow these kind of divergent kind of like pathways among all the areas in that city, even if like they weren't evaluated by Hulk or not. So we can kind of get at that logic, but it still has its problems because then you have to make the assumption that like, okay, cities couldn't look across at other cities and kind of learn kind of segregationist logic from them. So it's like, you know, we can do some things to move there, but we got to be really creative in how we do so. Yeah. Oh, how do you mean? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is where my limitations on history. I'm not a historian, so probably I don't know. I like actually barely know little of the history on that, but I think it's something you can find out. And yeah, it could be an interesting kind of analytical point because you know you could have these Hulk maps. They come with kind of like the appraisals, kind of the appraiser's notes, so you can go back and see like, okay, were they writing down there's a black neighborhood here, and kind of like figure out kind of like if they may have missed that and maybe line that up with like these kind of like you know, we have full census count data from back then, so maybe you can kind of line those two up to figure out like kind of like where there have been kind of like black households there that they just missed because they were passing as white or some other reason, and that could be kind of like an interesting thing to look at, kind of the development of those spaces. Yeah, totally, it's totally possible. I don't know how to do it, but it's totally possible, it seems.
Yeah, man, great talk. Great talk. First question is, so you have this, is it that you have kind of two times thing, or you actually developing data of the data, and you're actually analyzing data along the way?
Yeah, we're analyzing data along the way. So, you know, the historical data is like uneven, so like we can't do a fantastic job of capturing these things. Yeah, but we can get like the urban renewal projects come from the 50s and 60s. We actually have measures of, you know, all these other factors measured at the actual time that they were like existing. Yeah, we're not just summing and yeah, flattening things out.
So are you, so I think it's potentially quantifiable mediating mechanisms that are currently identified now. So one is out migration. So we know that city-state migrants are health. You know, I'm speaking a lot about Hamilton. City-state migrants are a lot more health than folks who don't. So if over the, 75 years, whatever, a bunch of people now, maybe what you got left are unhealthy people, and that's what's coming up in your in the end.
Yeah.
Ellis, published that social science and medicine paper on in-state and mental health, showing that when Black people have a later sense of their lives or the quality of their lives, think the lives of Black people want to in the United States, that end up with little pressure. And Tony Brown recently presented in our workshop where he showed that Black people had a stronger sense of that being Black was a strong part of how much they thought of themselves. They had a higher allostatic load than a number of stressors. So my point here is that talk a lot about logic, which to me has something like meaning inference, some kind of state of thinking that is instilled in the neighborhood, and that you are currently not modeling, right? You don't have attitudinal measures or perception measures.
Sure.
I'm wondering, to what extent might you think of, and I'm just totally making it up, like overlaying like GSS attitudinal data over the spaces, or because GSS is like 60 or whatever.
Yeah.
Some like way of, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really actually we should talk more about this because it serves like a real specific kind of purpose. So one thing that we're kind of finding in this that we don't quite know how to contextualize yet is that it looks like kind of like Black communities that are kind of situated in these places that were kind of like marked grade D, like are actually performing slightly better on these health indicators than kind of like, yeah, exactly. And so I think there's there's some of these kind of like conceptualization of kind of like being from a long-standing Black neighborhood. It's like these places crystallized, they formed kind of like these kind of different logic about like different identities kind of around kind of like what it means to be Black and kind of pride there. And then also probably some institutional kind of like, it's like, well, if the state's not going to take care of us, like we're going to do it ourselves, right? In these alternative kind of institutions. And so I think that sort of stuff is like exactly what we need. Like I like that GIS kind of like thing, or GSS, yeah. That GSS kind of like example of like using that as a mediator for like, okay, what are the kind of the identities like kind of going, like happening in these places that have long been crystallized as Black. And if that can kind of explain some of those, like, because, we're not going to put that out there decontextualized because it would be, we need the strong theory, but I think that's a good one. Yeah, totally. But no, I think that stuff is totally at play here. We're seeing, I think what that is in the results and needs to be interrogated further. Yeah. Yeah. No, totally. Yeah. And it's actually like in the conclusion of the paper, it was kind of the motivating kind of like force for this paper in the first place was kind of looking at some of the kind of policies that kind of like, we're becoming, everyone's becoming a little bit more fluent in kind of understanding kind of like structural racism. But then we see the policies that come out and it's just like airdrop like supplies into a formerly degraded kind of neighborhood, right? And so we set it up as that tension where like on one hand, those sorts of policies, there are durable harms that kind of like existed, like getting marked as A versus D had these durable harms, and we need to have these kind of place specific kind of interventions to kind of go in there, reinvest, kind of like work out kind of like all kind of that embedded kind of like harm that was kind of done by this particular institutional exposure. but then also not leaving it at that point, because it's like, it's just not like kind of, we can't be kind of so one-to-one in the interventions that we designed, because these things have kind of like much harder kind of to identify, much broader kind of implications for social equity, that if we kind of lead, or if we just follow that kind of like one-to-one logic in our interventions too closely, we're going to not really kind of do much. We're going to take like yeah. So point is, it's like, I think that like what I would want a policy, any policy people to kind of like take from this is like, this stuff is important, right? Like these discrete kind of interventions on particular places are important, but it can't be all that we do. What we do about this, good luck, right? Like it's unfortunately like a real sticky problem about the underlying kind of racialized logic in this country. And it's just a much harder problem to solve, but we can't just kind of be satisfied kind of intervening on these kind of on pathways like this, or design interventions around that. Yeah. Totally. Mm-hmm. Right. Totally. Yeah, totally. I just was talking to Alex today about, like, I was like, we're not doing any kind of regional variation this, and I feel ashamed, right? But you do see it. I mean, I think it's an essential, so it's an essential kind of like thing to consider, and we often kind of overlook it in kind of building these models out. There are reasons for it, because like thinking about like kind of how to decompose stuff that has this kind of like spatial heterogeneity in it, like the methods barely kind of are appropriate for kind of like a straightforward kind of like one size fit all kind of like approach. So figuring out kind of the spatial component and integrating that spatial heterogeneity into kind of the models, it's just like, I mean, it probably can be done, but it just hasn't been a lot of thought done there yet. But conceptually, like, it makes a whole lot of sense. So I showed this a kind of map of kind of Dallas Fort Worth where, and I realized I didn't explain this map, but that's okay. Where kind of like there's not a ton of overlap between kind of grade D and grade D kind of neighborhoods and contemporary kind of like life expectancy or kind of other economic outcomes among kind of Black communities. But you look in other cities and it's almost a one-to-one kind of like relation, right? It's like very kind of like strong legacy. And so it's something that needs to be kind of like considered a little bit more. And again, like I was just saying, like not getting too, try to follow the data and what we can do too closely. And so there's a researcher at WashU, David Rigby, who does a bunch of historical work. And we're kind of looking at this and trying to see if we can categorize kind of like different kind of metro areas that we're kind of trying to like achieve different kind of racialized projects at the time. Like what Seattle and Portland were trying to do about racial control was a little different than kind of like what the South was trying to do, and trying to figure out like how these maps were kind of like used in that, and if that kind of affected how sticky they were, and if that kind of like helps explain kind of the regional variation and the overlap and stuff. So that's a brand new project, but I think it's important stuff, because this one size fit all kind of like thing it's a statistical convenience, but it's just not a theoretically tenable one. Yeah.
Well, you answered my question.
Yeah.
The other part that I'm curious thinking about time and the development of small cities into massive
Right.
metro complexes, right? Like, I believe that there's a redlining map for Phoenix, but this does not look like what people look like.
Right. Yeah.
So, thinking about considering, I liked your framework of talking about how racial ideologies kind of were pervasive in informing how thought about spaces that were not open farmland or part of racial ideology. So I think that's a nice way to think about that. Just also wondering how you're considering relative to these trauma, like passive withdrawal.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I'm not concerned at all. I mean, it needs to be considered, though. It needs to be considered. So I'll give you an example in another kind of project that Nick and I are kicking up, and it's like trying to like kind of like figure out kind of like what treatment effects we should be estimating for the legacy of like enslavement, right? Because a lot of the kind of literature is just like, okay, we're going to think about it in the South alone, but like making the assumption that kind of these spaces that didn't exist at the time, like you think about the Northwest, were unaffected by that exposure, right? Just doesn't make any sense. Like the West looked to the South and like kind of understood kind of like what the racial hierarchy were and probably picked up lessons. And so I think that's probably happening on a local scale with this kind of like urban sprawl where, again, you get back to that kind of Faber argument where it's just like deciding to do this or not was like kind of like really is like kind of like where kind of the meat of the exposure is. So I would imagine that like in Phoenix, it's just like, you know, city develop. It was the same people that were on Hulk's board were probably involved with kind of like the development of those spaces. And so they carried that logic forward in the development of it. But again, how you identify that and isolate that like with data, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, but it's important. I think it's an important dynamic that we have to figure out a way to capture. Oh, is that okay? Yay. Thanks, everybody.